Look at this bottle. This bottle costs 5,400 rupees on a normal retail shop in Bangalore. But then I got this just for 2,600 rupees from the duty-free section of the International Bangalore Airport. This huge price difference, which is of 56% by the way, is only possible because duty-free shops don't charge you taxes like GST and import duty, which normal retail shops must charge. But then the question I'm asking here is, why is our government allowing such tax-free shops to exist? On one hand, our government has taxed almost every item that a common man buys. Even institutions like IT Delhi are not spared from the GST notices. But then, international passengers, which already have higher incomes, which already have higher purchasing power, why do they get to buy expensive products without paying any tax? In this video, I will tell you why government allow these kind of shops to exist. And by the way, duty-free shops exist not just in India, but on almost every other international airport in the world. And what happened when our government did try to tax these shops? Finally, I will make the case why it is in our benefit to not collect taxes from these duty-free shops. And this will go on to show what happens, what are the indirect benefits, what are the second layer benefits that a low tax structure provide to the economy. In the 1940s, World War II was in full swing. This devastated nearly every country in Europe except a few which didn't participate in the war. At the time, the best way to travel between US and Europe was by these seaplanes, which used to run between America and Ireland. These seaplanes were not only cheap, but they were practical for one more reason. At the time, Europe did not have long runways. On the other hand, these seaplanes could easily land in water, something that Europe had in abundance. These seaplanes, after crossing the Atlantic Ocean, used to land in Ireland on Fawn's Flying Boat Base. These seaplanes were also called flying boats, by the way, because aren't these boats that can just fly? But why did these seaplanes, aka flying boats, land specifically in Ireland? Ireland was favorable because geographically it was one of the closest locations to the United States. Moreover, Ireland remained neutral during World War II, which made this country safe to travel to. Inside the Fawn's Flying Boat Base, there was an ordinary man working as a caterer named Brendan O'Regan. He served food and drinks to passengers waiting at the airport. In 1945, when World War II ended, Ireland began building long concrete runways. As a result, Fawn's Flying Boat Base was closed and a new airport with a proper runway was opened called the Shannon International Airport. Remember Brendan O'Regan, who was working as a caterer in Fawn's Flying Boat Base? Now he started working as a caterer in this new airport. At the same time, seaplanes were replaced by piston engine planes. But the problem was these piston engine planes were actually not meant to travel really long distances, like say for example between US and central parts of Europe. Commercial long-range jet engine planes were still not invented at this time. It will take 7 more years till they are finally invented in 1952. This is why any flight that was going to Europe from either US or Canada needed to make a stop in Shannon Airport of Ireland, where they could be refueled to continue the journey towards the rest of Europe. Basically, Shannon Airport served as a transit hub where either the existing flights were refueled or passengers would just take connecting flights to the rest of Europe. During those times, if you were someone who was traveling from US to Europe, the only possible way was to go via this Shannon Airport in Ireland. It didn't matter whether you were a celebrity or a diplomat or even a president. You had to go through this Shannon International Airport. One day, airport's caterer Brendan O'Regan was observing transit passengers who were waiting for the next flight. And he gets an idea. Why not sell some Ireland's local produce to them? He says to himself, even though World War II had ended, the effects of war were still there. Countries were struggling financially, families were desperate to find ways to supplement their income. Brendan O'Regan's idea to sell Ireland's local produce to international passengers stemmed from this very desperation. But as a true businessman, he started to think of ways how can he incentivize transit passengers to buy his products at the airport. Then he gets a game-changer idea. Brendan O'Regan goes to his government, the Ireland government, and starts by giving examples of cruise ships. Cruise ships sail on international waters. Therefore, they don't pay any tax for the product consumed on the cruise ship. Reasoning is, as cruise ships are sailing in international waters, any product consumed on these cruise ships was not consumed in any one particular country. Therefore, no country had the right to collect taxes from anything that is consumed on these cruise ships. And then Brendan O'Regan makes the game changer argument. What are airplanes if not ships of air? After listening to Brendan O'Regan's arguments, Irish government gives Brendan O'Regan a go-ahead on trial basis to sell Ireland's local products on airport without any tax, aka duty-free products. Initially, Brendan O'Regan starts selling items like eggs, cheese, bread and whiskey on the airport. And this concept of duty-free shopping took off. Like, can you imagine today buying eggs at the airport's duty-free section? Of all the products Brendan O'Regan sold in duty-free, sales of whiskey shot through the roof. Even during those times, almost every country was levying very high taxes on alcohol. So when suddenly the same bottle was available for 50% of the cost at Ireland's airport, people bought them in whatever amount they could. Brendan O'Regan's experiment worked. Irish government was happy as these passengers waiting in transit used to spend in dollars and pounds at the airport, which Ireland desperately needed, especially after World War II. The second order effects of these were significant. The airport's revenue grew, new jobs were created, and the sale of Ireland's local products, including its world-renowned Irish whiskey, increased. Moreover, if we think about it from Ireland government's perspective, Ireland government is also actually not losing any tax revenue. These transit passengers anyway are not stepping out of the airport to spend their money on the local product. Therefore, government is anyways not earning any tax revenue from them. At least now by introducing duty-free products at the airport, government is able to extract indirect benefits from these passengers, which, as I said, Ireland desperately needed after World War II. After the success of duty-free shops in Ireland, almost every other country started opening duty-free shops at the international airport. Today, Dubai's duty-free is one of the largest duty-frees of the world, bringing in more than $2 billion in revenue. India's duty-free revenue is around $540 million or $0.54 billion, which is roughly 1/4 of that of Dubai's. And this is because Dubai is a transit hub for all passengers. So if you're traveling from east to west, generally there is a layover in Dubai, which means higher passenger traffic, which means higher duty-free sales. But now, let's look more closely at Indian airports. Unlike Ireland and Dubai, for Indian airports, 80% of travelers are Indians rather than foreigners. This means for these Indians, they would have bought the same product from a normal retail shop, paying all import duties and GST had the option of duty-free was not available. Think about it. If I want to buy a perfume and I know I'm traveling abroad next month, I will make my purchase from the duty-free shop instead of the normal retail shop, causing the government to lose on custom duty, causing the government to lose on GST, means causing the government to lose on tax revenue on me. There were at least 3 cases where GST department did send notices to these duty-free shops asking for GST to be paid on duty-free sales. So first of all, let's be very clear of the tax rules. Whenever a product reaches Indian shores, it needs to cross custom barriers of India to enter India. As soon as the product crosses the custom barrier, a custom duty needs to be paid on the product in accordance with the Indian Customs Act of 1962. Let's understand this with an example. A bottle of imported perfume attracts 43.96% in custom duties as soon as it crosses the custom boundary of India. Now, as this bottle is sold to you from a nearby store, GST of 18% is also applicable. It is levied on the final bill value. So, a bottle with a cost of 10,000 rupees gets sold for 16,987 rupees. This is a hefty premium of 70%. Now coming back to the duty-free shops. They are said to be located just before the custom barriers of the country. Therefore, when this exact perfume is sold in duty-free shops, no 43.96% import duty is applicable. Now, as you're buying this perfume outside the custom barrier of India, this sale of perfume to you is considered as an export. Now, since exports are exempted from the GST under GST Act, even this 18% GST is not applicable on this perfume sale. Now just remember this thing about the product, right? This product is not attracting 18% GST because this product is classified as an export, and exports don't attract GST. Back in 2017, when government introduced GST in India, there was no separate section for duty-free shops. At that time, GST Act defined export of goods in Section 2 of the GST Act as taking goods out of India to a place outside India. Since there was no mention of custom barriers or there was no special section allotted to duty-free shops, GST officials interpreted export as taking goods physically out of India. Using this definition, GST department started sending out GST notices to demand GST on duty-free sales from these shops. These cases went to court where government argued since the transaction at duty-free shops is still happening within the legal boundaries of India. It's fine if they're happening outside the custom barrier, but they're still happening within the physical boundaries of India. A duty-free sale is legally not an export, at least per the GST Act of 2017. Therefore, GST is applicable and thus GST needs to be paid. It's fine if you don't pay custom duty, but please pay GST as transaction is still happening within the legal boundaries of India. Different cases went to different high courts, some of which GST department won, while others they lost to duty-free shops. Finally, Supreme Court interfered and ruled against GST officials. Supreme Court said anything that you buy in a duty-free shop can only be consumed outside India. Therefore, a consumption tax like GST cannot be applicable because you're not consuming it within India. If you would have noticed, anything that you buy on a duty-free shop is given to you after sealing in a plastic bag. Supreme Court further explained, even though you have bought an item from the duty-free shop, you still are not the owner of the particular item. Now we are getting into the technicalities of the order. Supreme Court said you're just a courier of that item. You become the owner of that item once you reach your final destination. Thus, anything that you buy in a duty-free shop is an export to you and you can only use it after you courier that item to yourself. Interesting, right? After this ruling, a new section was introduced in the GST Act to exclude duty-free sales. Now we just talked about the legal aspect, but what about the economic impact? Not levying import duty and GST on duty-free products, is it a morally right thing to do? Is it economically the right thing to do? What if I tell you that if today we start collecting taxes on these duty-free items, we will be the ones who will be the losers in the long run? Look, Indian airports are either owned by the government or by a private company. For example, Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj International Airport or Mumbai International Airport. Although this airport is owned and operated by Adani, the holding structure of this airport looks like this. 74% of this airport is owned by Adani Airports Holdings Limited, while the rest 26% is actually owned by Airports Authority of India or AAI, aka government. Government airports are obviously 100% owned by governments, but even for private airports like Mumbai, Delhi, Ahmedabad, Lucknow, government has a stake of 26% via Airport Authority of India, aka AAI. With every private airport, government has actually entered into a revenue sharing agreement. For example, whatever revenue is generated by Delhi's airport, 45.99% of it goes to AAI. Similarly, 38.7% of Mumbai's airport's revenue goes to AAI, and duty-free shops make up a big chunk of airport's revenue. 57% of Delhi Airport's revenue was generated through non-aeronautical activities, half of which came from duty-free shops. That is, 28% of total revenue from duty-free shops. For both Mumbai and Bangalore's airport, non-aeronautical revenue share is around 50%, and duty-free shops form a considerable portion of that. In simpler words, higher duty-free sales means higher revenue for AAI, aka the government. Duty-free sales also reduce the pressure on an airport to earn from aeronautical activities. In absence of duty-free revenue, airport would be forced to increase landing charges, parking charges, user development fee, all of which would result in an increase in flight prices. So even though government is losing GST and import duty by providing duty-free sales, this is a short-term hit. But the second layer to the story is it is gaining in terms of increased revenue from these duty-free shops. Think from an international traveler's perspective. If I want to buy a perfume worth 10,000 rupees, but the government is asking me 18% GST on my purchase, even on airport, what will I do? I will simply buy it from my destination country after I land there, where I'll at least pay a lot less in taxes. Thus, India would not just lose on these tax revenue, but also on the second order benefits of duty-free sales. All this while I still haven't talked about increased corporate taxes due to higher revenue from the airports or even higher income tax collections from the increased employment to all those people who are working to support these duty-free shops. In my opinion, the story shows two things. How lower taxes can lead to increased demand and ultimately higher net revenue collected. We need to think from an overall long-term perspective and not just optimize for short-term tax collections. We need to think about all the second layer effects that having duty-free shops give us or having low taxes give us. Recently, government announced reduction of GST on many key items. This will be the stress test of our theory of low taxes but higher revenue. The other thing is, even today, our country focuses more on the letter of the law rather than the spirit of the law. Yes, sections specifically dealing with duty-free shops were not initially included in the GST Act. But using that to go after business establishments was uncalled for, especially when levying GST on duty-free sales would have resulted in so many negative consequences. If you love this video, share it with your friends. Let's meet in the next video. Thank you.